Welcome back, everybody. I've got a special guest with me now. This is Richard Gearhart, and he has got some tips for gig workers, all the gig workers out there. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Sonora. And I love to talk about this topic because it's great right before the holidays when people are trying to earn extra money. So, gig working is definitely the way to go. And what I'm going to talk about here is 5 ways to keep yourself from getting screwed if you're a member of the gig economy. And even celebrities now are doing the gig thing, like Elijah Wood, the Snoop Dogg, Carol Baskin from Tiger King. They're all doing the gig economy, and it's really exploding. So here are 5 tips that you need to keep in mind if you want to be successful in the gig economy. And the first is to stay with established apps. So these are established apps like TaskRabbit, Uber, Grubhub, Upwork, Fiverr, uh, and the reason why you want to stay with these 5 apps is number one, they get a lot of work. And number two, they help you get paid, which, if you're in the gig economy, is job number one. Absolutely. The second thing that you want to do if you want to be successful in the gig economy is make sure that you know who's going to own the project. Now, you may be saying, well, Richard, that's ridiculous. Of course, the person who pays for the project owns it, but that's not necessarily the case. Bill Gates, when he was negotiating his contract with IBM to build the Windows software, put a clause in the contract that said he got to keep the Windows software, even though IBM had to pay for it. And that one decision made Bill Gates one of the richest people in the world right now. The third thing that you want to keep in mind is the scope, understanding what the scope of the project is. So, for example, I had a client once who came into my office and had a dispute with somebody who he hired on TaskRabbit. He hired somebody to paint a room, and he came home and the room was painted, but none of the trims was painted, none of the windows, the door, the baseboards. The guy he hired thought that all he had to do was paint the walls. And when he said paint the room, he thought he was going to have the entire room painted. And naturally, they got into a little bit of a discussion about that. So understanding the scope and what you're supposed to do is really important. And so this in law is called a meeting of the minds. And so both parties understand what the job is to be done. And the guy in the painting thing, that was a completely wrong meeting of the minds there, which is why they got into trouble. The fourth thing is to make sure that your job is funded before you start, right? So for most of the major gig apps like Uber, for example, you have to guarantee the work with a credit card before you start. Well, not every app is like that. There's a bajillion gig worker apps out there. And one of the things that the established apps are good at is making sure that you get paid. And so if you want to make sure that that gig is funded, and you don't want to start work on the job before it's funded, because that can cause all sorts of problems and you may never get your money. And finally, the most important thing is make sure you understand the app rules, or if you're signing a contract, that that you read the contract and that you understand it. So I have had a client one time, and she worked for a small virtual assistance firm, and she was really liked by her boss, and they wanted to hire her full time. But because of the contract that she signed with a virtual assistant firm, she had a very hard time making the transition from gig worker to full-time employee. So those are the 5 things you need to keep in mind if you want to stay cool in the gig economy.
Awesome. Those are some amazing tips. Thank you so much for sharing those with us. So, for folks who, really want to delve into this and find out more, how do they contact you?
Best way to get in touch with me is through my website, and it's www.gearhartlaw.com. And I respond to every email personally, and I'd love to help anyone who needs help in this area.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much for coming on this show. And yeah, we appreciate all the tips.